In May of 1941, Rudolf Hess was officially the second most powerful person in the command structure of the then rapidly ascendant Third Reich. On the night of May 10, 1941, Hess undertook an extraordinary secret mission. He flew a military aircraft solo from Germany to Britain, apparently without anyone else's knowledge. That night, a Scottish farmer discovered a German Messerschmitt aircraft in flames in his field. The pilot, who initially gave his name as Captain Alfred Horn, turned out to be none other than Rudolf Hess. This bizarre solo flight by a top-ranking German leader, which Hess described as a mission of peace, unfolded just weeks before Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Immediately, it sparked questions and theories that persist to this day about what exactly prompted Hess's bizarre journey. Hess had taken off from an airfield near Munich in a twin-engine Messerschmitt on the evening of May 10th. Around 6 p.m., he headed northwest, skimming along the Rhine, and then turning out over the North Sea towards Scotland. Navigating by charts and maps, Hess flew alone for about 1,000 miles through darkness and dodged British air defenses. By 10:30 p.m., he was over southern Scotland, running low on fuel, and was forced to bail out of the plane just a few miles short of his intended destination. Parachuting into a farm field near the village of Eaglesham, he landed with a sprained ankle but alive. The local farmer who found him quickly alerted the home guard, who moved quickly to apprehend the downed German airman. But then things took an unusual turn that continues to fascinate historians and the public to this day. Hess calmly requested to speak with the Duke of Hamilton, a prominent Scottish aristocrat, insisting he had an important message to deliver. Hess's choice of target was Dungavel House, the estate of the 14th Duke of Hamilton. Hess claimed that he knew the Duke, but the Duke of Hamilton denied having ever met Hess. Acting on advice from his friend, Hess believed that the Duke was part of a secret anti-Churchill faction in Britain, willing to negotiate peace. This turned out to be a grave miscalculation on the part of Hess. In reality, the Duke of Hamilton was a loyal British officer and a friend of Winston Churchill, not a member of any pro-German peace party. When Hess was taken into custody, he clung to the idea that if he could only meet the Duke, he could broach a proposal to end the conflict between Britain and Germany on German terms. Hess later explained that the offer he carried was essentially this: Germany would guarantee the British Empire's continued existence and integrity if Britain would agree to Germany's dominance on the continent. This mirrored a long-standing formula that Hitler himself had personally toyed with both before and during the war. This was effectively a negotiated peace, where each empire keeps to its own sphere and maintains a generally cordial outlook towards one another. British authorities, meanwhile, were astonished by the unexpected visitor. Hess was granted a meeting with the Duke of Hamilton the following day, May 11, 1941, but the conversation yielded nothing. The Duke listened to Hess's peace plea only out of courtesy, and Churchill's government had no intention of striking a deal with the Germans. Hess also revealed from the start that he had come entirely on his own initiative, emphatically denying that anyone in the German leadership had sent him. By renouncing any official backing, Hess unwittingly sealed his own fate. Far from being treated as a diplomatic envoy, he was now simply a high-profile prisoner of war. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, suspecting that Hess was either mentally unhinged or on a rogue escapade, made it clear Britain would close ranks and treat Hess strictly as a captive. He was placed under guard and moved to various secure locations. For a time, Hess was even locked in the Tower of London, while British intelligence officers interrogated him thoroughly. Over the next weeks and months, Hess grew despondent, as it became obvious that his self-styled peace mission had utterly failed. On June 16, 1941, barely 5 weeks after his landing, Hess attempted to end himself in captivity by throwing himself down a staircase, but he survived with injuries. Medical and psychiatric examinations followed, and Hess's behavior grew increasingly erratic, marked by depression and paranoid delusions. To outside observers, the once formidable deputy of the Reich now appeared to be a disturbed man. Churchill himself, writing after the war, described Hess's dramatic flight as a deed of lunatic benevolence. This was implying that, however misguided or insane Hess's action was, he perhaps believed he was doing something good. Churchill argued that Hess's case was more medical than criminal, given the seemingly irrational nature of the mission. In short, the British leadership concluded that Hess was a lone actor, driven by his own peculiar motivations, and they treated him as such. Back in Germany, news of Rudolf Hess's bizarre flight stunned the German high command. When Hitler learned that his deputy had secretly flown to Britain and fallen into enemy hands, he reacted with furor and disbelief. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels recorded in his diary the alarm that Hess's defection caused. According to him, members of the German public were openly breaking ranks and questioning how such a lunatic could have been second in command. To quell rumors and maintain morale, Berlin swiftly put out an official story. Hess had succumbed to mental illness on the day of the flight, and his unauthorized flight was the misguided act of a man no longer sane. In essence, propaganda told the people that he was completely sane the day before and suffered some kind of mental break. Again, this was put out immediately to let the German people know that no, Hess wasn't second in command while mentally ill, but rather it was all sudden. Hitler instructed his regime to disavow Hess completely. Publicly, his response was quite measured, and he declared that Hess's mission was entirely without his knowledge or consent. Privately, according to eyewitnesses, he was livid at what he saw as a betrayal. Architect Albert Speer, who was present at Hitler's headquarters when the news came, later described his reaction as an inarticulate, almost animal outcry of rage. What enraged him most was the fear that Churchill might use Hess's flight to cast doubt on Germany's intentions. He also worried that this appeared to be a peace feeler that could be viewed by allies as a potential stab in the back. In the wake of Hess's defection, Hess was stripped of all his posts and titles. Hess's former duties were assigned to others, and within Germany, Hess's name was practically erased from the regime's public life. Goebbels and others, though shaken by the incident, took comfort in the fact that Hess had not been a key player in wartime strategy. By 1941, his influence had waned, and he was increasingly seen as an eccentric, sidelined by more forceful members of the regime. Some in the inner circle even suggested that Hess's motive for the flight was personal ambition. They believed that by securing this peace, he could ensure that he would forever be enshrined as the second most powerful person in the Reich, and not just on paper. Modern historians tend to view Hess's peace mission as a product of desperation and a warped mindset. By 1941, Hess had lost standing in the hierarchy and was known to be influenced by mysticism and astrology. His belief in secret British peace factions and his faith in dreams or supernatural forces suggests that Hess may indeed have been suffering from deteriorating mental health. British doctors who examined him during the war noted signs of mental illness, including paranoia and alternating depression and mania. The implication being that only a disturbed mind could have conceived such a risky solo mission for peace. Thus, one theory is simply that Hess was mentally unstable by 1941, leading him to act on delusions of being a peacemaker. Yet the full story is clouded by other theories, many of which are potentially credible. One persistent question has been whether Hess truly acted alone, or if others were covertly involved. For instance, was the Führer secretly aware of, or even behind, Hess's attempt? The regime insisted he was not, and most historians agree Hitler was genuinely shocked and angered. However, a few contemporaries believed otherwise. Many later expressed the opinion that Hitler's fury was theatrical, a cover for having approved Hess's mission in advance. Decades after the war, in 2011, a document emerged from Russian archives. This was reportedly a 28-page statement by Karl-Heinz Pinch, Hess's adjutant, and this document dropped a bombshell. It claimed that Hitler had expected Hess's initiative. According to Pinch's account, obtained under Soviet captivity for what it's worth, Hitler received the news very calmly in private. He advised that the Führer had sent Hess to secure peace and an economic alliance with the British Empire prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union. If true, this would mean Hitler and Hess had an understanding. Hess would try to negotiate with Britain, and if he failed, the regime could deny all involvement and call Hess insane. Others in the inner circle had the incentive to go along with Hess being declared mentally unfit, since this removed a competitor for power from the power struggle. It's a dramatic theory, but most scholars treat it with caution. Pinch gave that testimony while imprisoned and allegedly tortured by the Soviets. Further, after the war, the Soviets had their own propagandistic reasons to promote the idea of secret dealings between Britain and Germany. Moreover, multiple witnesses consistently observed that Hitler seemed genuinely caught off guard and enraged by Hess's stunt. The consensus today is that nobody in the German command structure authorized Hess's mission, aside from Hess himself. Indeed, it has been reported that the Luftwaffe was ordered to try to stop Hess once Hitler realized his deputy had taken off that night, though this has never been absolutely confirmed. Another question is whether British intelligence played any role in luring or facilitating Hess's journey. Could British agents have tricked Hess into flying over, dangling the prospect of receptive contacts in Britain? This idea was fervently asserted by the Soviet leader, who refused to believe Hess came without British collusion. Soviet propaganda later claimed that MI6 set a trap for Hess, possibly sending fake letters in the Duke of Hamilton's name to entice him. This may explain why Rudolf Hess was so convinced that he actually had a relationship with the Duke of Hamilton. Thus, this may not have been the rantings of a madman, but rather someone who had been manipulated by the expert British Foreign Intelligence Service. That said, the evidence on this isn't entirely clear, though it is possible that the Brits had identified Hess as a weak link in the German leadership. For instance, it's possible that they received intelligence reports about the increasingly unusual behavior Hess was exhibiting and pushed this advantage. That said, at this point, it would be expected that some primary source would have come out to indicate this. Rudolf Hess remained in British custody for the rest of World War II. In 1945, he was returned to Germany to face the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg as a major war criminal. At the trial, Hess alternated between apathy and odd displays of memory loss, at one point claiming amnesia, but he was judged sane enough to stand trial. And it's important to note that this doesn't mean that he was sane at the time of trial, but rather at the time that the offenses were committed. Rudolf Hess was convicted of crimes against peace, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. From 1947 onward, Hess lived out the next 40 years behind bars in Berlin's Spandau prison. As other prisoners were released over the decades, Hess became the sole inmate at Spandau, guarded in turn by American, British, French, and Soviet military police. He died in 1987 at the age of 93, apparently by his own hand, and even his death sparked yet another round of theories. To the very end, Hess never truly explained the full reasoning behind his fateful flight to Scotland. That said, it's theoretically possible that at some point, some German records may come forward to prove that he had made the flight on official orders. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary mysteries of all kinds. Also, huge shout out to everyone who supports my channel on Patreon and through YouTube memberships. On a cold February afternoon in 1942, thick black smoke billowed over Manhattan's west side as flames devoured one of the world's most magnificent ocean liners. The SS Normandie, pride of the French fleet, had been berthed at New York's Pier 88 and was in the midst of being converted for wartime service when disaster struck. By nightfall on February 9th, 1942, the grand ship was an inferno. By the next morning, she lay on her port side in the Hudson River, half submerged and ruined. Was this calamity an accident? Or had saboteurs struck in the heart of the city? Or, as later evidence would show, had the Mafia pulled off perhaps the most audacious protection racket scheme in American history? The Normandie was the pride of the French line, a floating palace launched in 1935 amid a fierce international rivalry for the fastest, largest ocean liner. Built at Saint-Nazaire, France, she entered service as the world's largest and speediest passenger ship. Everything about Normandie radiated luxury and national prestige. Her Art Deco interiors were opulent. The first-class dining hall alone was larger than any afloat at the time, and she could carry nearly 2,000 passengers with a crew of over 1,300 serving them. Celebrities, tycoons, and even royalty sailed aboard Normandie during the 30s, cementing her reputation as the most glamorous liner of her era. Despite the acclaim, however, her career would be brief, and world events were about to overtake this great queen of the ocean. When World War II broke out in Europe in September 1939, the Normandie happened to be in New York Harbor, which turned out to be a stroke of fate. Rather than risk returning across U-boat patrolled seas, the great liner sought refuge in the neutral United States. The U.S. government interned the ship on September 3, 1939, the same day France declared war on Germany, ensuring she stayed in port and out of Axis hands. For months, Normandie remained moored at her Manhattan pier under the watch of her French crew, and after May 1940, under the guard of U.S. Coast Guard personnel as well. The fall of France in 1940 heightened fears that agents of Germany or the collaborationist Vichy regime might sabotage the vessel. Indeed, U.S. Coast Guard records from 1940 show that dozens of guards were assigned to protect Normandie from espionage or sabotage attempts. The ship stayed safe through 1941, maintained by her French crew, who kept an elaborate fire watch system in place, even as she sat idle in New York. Everything changed after the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 12, 1941, federal authorities seized the Normandie under the right of angry. This is the doctrine that allows appropriation of neutral foreign property for wartime use, and to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. 2 weeks later, she was transferred to the U.S. Navy, which rechristened her the USS Lafayette in honor of the Marquis of the same name. And just a quick programming note, for consistency's sake, I'm going to keep referring to this ship as the Normandie throughout this video. Plans were swiftly drawn up to convert the luxurious liner into a troop transport capable of carrying thousands of American soldiers to Europe. The conversion of Normandie into a warship, however, was rushed and fraught with challenges. Work began in early January 1942, right at Pier 88, since shipyards were packed with urgent projects. The ship's elegant fittings and furniture were hastily stripped out to make way for barracks and military equipment. Deadlines were tight. Navy brass initially wanted the Lafayette ready to sail by mid-February 1942, and this pressure led to corners being cut. Hundreds of civilian contractors swarmed the vessel alongside Navy personnel, and communication was often poor. Based on what was about to happen, some have speculated if these contractors were properly vetted for Axis or Mafia connections, but I'll get to that in a moment. Critical safety systems, such as Normandie's state-of-the-art fire suppression apparatus, were partially disabled during the refit. In a troubling oversight, the French-sized fire hydrant connections on the ship were not yet adapted for New York Fire Department hoses. To drop one of my favorite Simpsons quotes in an uncharacteristically unironic way, "Boy, I really hope someone got fired for that blunder." On the afternoon of February 9th, 1942, tragedy struck. Around 2:30 p.m., a spark flared from a worker's acetylene-cutting torch in the Normandie's grand first-class salon. A team was removing large decorative stanchions in this lavish lounge-turned-work site. As Clement Derrick, a welder, cut through metal, his torch's sparks ignited piles of life vests and burlap that were temporarily stored nearby. Within seconds, flames raced across the flammable materials. Workers tried desperately to smother the fire with their coats and whatever was at hand, but the blaze grew too quickly. The ship's own fire sprinkler system had been shut off for the conversion work, leaving only handheld extinguishers and hoses. Alarms sounded and the New York City Fire Department rushed to the scene, arriving about 15 minutes after the alarm was raised. By that time, much of the Normandie's lavish interior was ablaze from her lower decks up to the promenade. A strong winter wind coming off the Hudson fanned the flames, pushing the fire toward the bow. As black smoke poured out and sirens wailed, crowds gathered along the Hudson to watch the crisis unfold. New York's mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, even cut short a live radio broadcast when he heard the news and raced to the pier to take charge of the emergency response. By early evening, after hours of intense effort, firefighters finally managed to get the fire under control, and around 6 p.m., the flames had largely been extinguished. However, the danger to the Normandie was not over. The enormous volumes of water pumped into the ship, an estimated 6,000 tons, had badly destabilized her. Normandie began to list to her port side as water accumulated on the lower decks and could not be pumped out efficiently. Officers ordered counterflooding of compartments to balance the ship, but this measure failed. Shortly after midnight, with Normandie listing past recovery, the order was given to abandon efforts to rescue the ship. In the early hours of February 10, 1942, the mighty liner succumbed to gravity and capsized at her pier. In the span of 12 hours, one of the greatest ships ever built had been reduced to a smoldering wreck. Miraculously, and almost unbelievably, given the scale of the fire, only one person perished in the disaster. That sole fatality was a civilian shipyard worker on the fire watch team who was tragically caught in the smoke. About 200 others, including firefighters, sailors with the Coast Guard, and workers, were injured or treated for burns and smoke inhalation. In the immediate aftermath of the Normandie fire, shock gave way to suspicion. This was February 1942, only 2 months after Pearl Harbor, and nerves in America were on edge. Many New Yorkers couldn't believe that a ship as grand as Normandie would simply catch fire and capsize due to an accident. Rumors swirled in the city. Sabotage was on everyone's lips. Some claimed to know that someone had tampered with the ship's firefighting equipment. Others pointed out the eerie timing. The U.S. had just entered the war, so perhaps Axis spies were sending a message. These fears were not unfounded in context. Just a month before the fire, in January 1942, a massive German spy ring had been cracked in the United States. Moreover, German U-boats were prowling off the East Coast at that very moment, sinking Allied merchant ships within sight of American shores. So when Normandie went up in flames, many Americans assumed it was the work of enemy saboteurs, if not German, then perhaps Italians or local fascist sympathizers. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, while urging calm, didn't dismiss the sabotage theory initially. He asked the Navy Department pointedly whether any Axis nationals had been working aboard Normandy during the conversion. J. Edgar Hoover's agents swarmed the wreck and interviewed every witness they could find. They brought Clement Derrick, the unlucky welder who literally sparked the event, back to a similar setting with the same type of materials. Under controlled conditions, Derrick recreated the welding job he had been doing. Sure enough, the sparks from his torch ignited the burlap-wrapped life jackets in a flash, precisely duplicating the start of the Normandy fire. This dramatic experiment strongly indicated that the disaster could indeed have been a tragic accident, not sabotage. As evidence mounted, the official verdict began to solidify. A U.S. Navy inquiry and a congressional investigation followed, each uncovering the same root causes: carelessness, miscommunication, and rushed work. But that's not where the mystery ends. Even as the FBI and Navy wrapped up their investigations in 1942 by affirming the accidental cause of the Normandy fire, alternative theories lingered. One of the most intriguing involved the Mafia. In the shadows of the New York waterfront, organized crime figures had their own tale about the Normandy's demise. Years later, members of the mob claimed that they had sabotaged the ship, not Germans or Italian agents or careless welders. According to this underworld narrative, mobster Charles Lucky Luciano and his associates saw an opportunity in early 1942. Luciano was at that time sitting in a New York prison, serving a long sentence, but he still held enormous sway over the dock workers' unions through his lieutenants. As the story goes, Luciano had floated a bold idea. If the Mafia could stage a sabotage incident in the harbor, say, a spectacular fire on a high-profile ship, the U.S. Navy would come begging for mob help to secure the docks. In return for that help, Luciano hoped to win favor, and perhaps even freedom. This theory alleges that the Kingpin's goons carried out the plan. Anthony Anastasio, who was an underworld authority figure on the Brooklyn docks, allegedly arranged for arsonists to set the Normandy ablaze as a way to prove the docks were vulnerable. In effect, the Mafia would frighten the U.S. government and then offer protection, a protection racket on a scale never before seen in mob history. Luciano, through intermediaries, did in fact open channels to naval intelligence after the Normandy fire, offering to guarantee no more enemy sabotage in New York Harbor. At the time, these dealings were top secret due to the potential political fallout for working with such individuals. In March 1942, just weeks after the Normandy disaster, the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence did enlist the help of the Mafia in what was codenamed Operation Underworld. Naval records declassified years later confirm that naval intelligence officers met with Lucky Luciano himself to secure the docks. The mobster was quietly transferred to a more comfortable prison and given authority to communicate with his men. In exchange for the mob's cooperation in keeping New York Harbor safe, Luciano's prison sentence was eventually commuted. He was eventually released early and was immediately deported back to Italy in 1946 for his service during the war. Did the Mafia truly set the Normandy fire to kickstart this devil's bargain? Definitive proof is elusive, and no court ever charged anyone with sabotaging the Normandy, and the official conclusion still classifies it as an accident. Derrick, the welder responsible for sparking off the event, was very thoroughly investigated, and despite this, no ties were noted to any criminal organizations. Yet the circumstantial evidence and later mob anecdotes keep this theory alive as a tantalizing possibility. Also, given that the Navy started colluding with the mob in the wake of this event, it's possible that the investigation into Derrick, or any other mob figures, was intentionally botched. Notably, at least one Mafia informant years later bragged that the mob, quote, did the Normandy job, but such claims could have been bluster. What is indisputable is that Operation Underworld happened, and the Navy's unprecedented alliance with organized crime was a direct response to the Normandy fire. The U.S. government, in essence, made a deal with gangsters to prevent any repeat of the Normandy disaster, a real-life twist that feels straight out of Goodfellas. It seems most likely based on the evidence that the Mafia simply happened to be in the right place at the right time. By controlling the dock workers, they were potentially the best candidates to ensure that individuals working on the dock didn't harbor any pro-Axis feelings.